Jake Morgan had expected to find shelter from the Montana blizzard, not a chest filled with the desperate final words of a murdered woman and her orphaned son. What he read by firelight that night would drag him into a 30-year-old mystery that someone had killed to keep buried. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Jake Morgan had been riding through the Montana wilderness for 3 days when the storm caught him. At 47 years old, he knew better than to push his luck against nature, but desperation had a way of making even wise men foolish. The October sky had turned the color of old bruises, pregnant with snow that would fall heavy and unforgiving once it started. His black stallion, Midnight, sensed the change before Jake did, ears flicking nervously as the temperature dropped with unsettling speed. They had been searching for the Chapman Ranch, a sprawling property Jake had heard about in a saloon 2 towns back. Word was they needed experienced hands for the winter, and Jake needed work more than he cared to admit. His last job had ended badly, not through any fault of his own, but when a ranch changes ownership and the new boss brings his own crew, loyalty means nothing against fresh blood and cheaper wages. So here he was, a man with 30 years of cowboy life behind him, riding through unfamiliar territory with nothing but his horse, his bedroll, and a leather saddlebag that held everything he owned in this world. The first snowflakes began to fall as they crested a ridge, and Jake pulled his worn duster tighter around his shoulders. The coat had seen better days, its leather scarred and faded from decades of sun and wind, but it was warm and familiar, like an old friend who never asked questions. Midnight snorted, his breath creating small clouds in the rapidly cooling air, and Jake patted the horse's neck with a gloved hand. They had been through worse together, he and this stallion. Jake had raised Midnight from a colt, training him with patience and respect rather than the harsh methods some cowboys preferred. That was 15 years ago, back when Jake still had a wife and a small ranch of his own in Wyoming, back when life held promises that seemed within reach if you just worked hard enough and played by the rules. But cancer doesn't care about rules or hard work, and Mary had been gone for 12 years now, taking with her the future they had planned, and leaving Jake with nothing but memories and an empty house he eventually sold because he couldn't bear to live there alone. The wind picked up, howling through the pine trees that surrounded them, and the snow began falling in earnest, thick white flakes that reduced visibility to almost nothing. Jake knew they needed shelter, and fast. Mountain storms in October were unpredictable and deadly, capable of dumping feet of snow in hours and burying a man before he even realized he was in trouble. He urged Midnight forward, trusting the horse's instincts as much as his own eyes, which were now struggling to make out anything beyond 20 feet in the swirling white chaos. That's when he saw it, a shape darker than the surrounding forest, barely visible through the curtain of snow. At first, he thought it might be a rock formation or a dense cluster of trees, but as they drew closer, Jake's heart quickened with hope. It was a cabin, small and weathered, sitting in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. The structure looked abandoned, its log walls gray with age and neglect, but the roof appeared intact, and right now, that was all that mattered. Jake dismounted carefully, his legs stiff from hours in the saddle, and led Midnight toward the cabin. His boots crunched through snow that was already several inches deep, and he could feel the cold seeping through the leather despite the thick wool socks Mary had knitted for him years ago. He still wore them, darning the holes when they appeared, unable to let go of one of the last tangible things she had made with her own hands. The cabin door hung slightly ajar, its hinges rusted but still functional. Jake pushed it open slowly, half expecting to find squatters or worse inside, but the interior was empty and dark. What little light penetrated the storm revealed a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, and what looked like the remains of a rope bed frame in one corner. Dust covered everything, and there were clear signs that animals had made temporary homes here over the years. But the structure was sound, the walls solid, and most importantly, it was dry. Jake led Midnight inside without hesitation. The cabin was large enough to accommodate both man and horse, and he wasn't about to leave his faithful companion outside in the storm. Midnight seemed to understand, walking through the doorway without protest and immediately shaking snow from his coat. Jake closed the door against the wind, and the sudden quiet was almost overwhelming after hours of howling storm. His first priority was getting a fire started. The fireplace showed signs of recent use, relatively recent anyway, perhaps within the last year or two. Someone else had found shelter here before him, and they had left behind a small stack of dry wood beside the hearth. Jake sent a silent thanks to whoever that person had been and set about building a fire. His hands, though cold, moved with practiced efficiency, arranging kindling and larger pieces of wood in a pattern that would catch and burn steadily. Within minutes, flames were crackling in the fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the log walls and filling the cabin with blessed warmth. Jake unsaddled Midnight and rubbed the horse down with an old blanket from his bedroll, checking his hooves and making sure he was comfortable. There was no proper stable, but the cabin would do, and Jake made a mental note to melt snow for water once the fire was strong enough. As the warmth began to seep into his bones and his eyes adjusted to the firelight, Jake noticed something he had missed in his initial survey of the cabin. In the far corner, partially hidden by shadows and what looked like an old canvas tarp, was a wooden chest. It was substantial, made of dark wood that gleamed dully in the flickering light, and it looked distinctly out of place in this abandoned shelter. Jake's curiosity was piqued. The chest was clearly old, but well made, the kind of craftsmanship you didn't see much anymore. Heavy iron bands reinforced its corners and edges, and a large lock hung from the latch, though it appeared to be broken, hanging open, as if inviting exploration. He approached slowly, Midnight watching with calm eyes as Jake knelt beside the chest. For a moment he hesitated. This wasn't his property, and the chest obviously belonged to someone. But the cabin had been abandoned for months, maybe years, and the chest itself looked like it had been here even longer. Besides, Jake reasoned, he was just curious. He wasn't planning to steal anything. He just wanted to know what would possess someone to leave such a substantial piece in an abandoned cabin in the middle of nowhere. Jake lifted the lid, and what he saw inside took his breath away. The chest was filled nearly to the brim with objects that seemed to glow in the firelight, but it wasn't gold or jewels that made his heart race. It was something far more unexpected, far more intriguing, and far more unbelievable than mere treasure. Inside the chest lay stacks upon stacks of letters, hundreds of them, tied with faded ribbons in bundles that spoke of careful organization and deep sentiment. But it wasn't just letters. There were photographs, tin-type images in ornate frames, a woman's wedding ring on a delicate gold chain, a child's wooden toy horse worn smooth from countless hours of play, and beneath it all, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, several leather-bound journals with pages yellowed by time. Jake sat back on his heels, overwhelmed by the intimacy of what he had discovered. This wasn't treasure in the conventional sense. This was someone's life, someone's memories, someone's heart laid bare and hidden away in this forgotten place. He felt like an intruder, a trespasser in someone else's sacred space. Yet he couldn't bring himself to close the lid and walk away. The storm continued to rage outside, the wind howling like a living thing trying to force its way through the cabin walls. Snow was piling up against the door, and Jake knew they would be here for the night, possibly longer depending on how much the storm dumped. He had nothing to do but tend the fire, care for Midnight, and wait. The chest sat before him, its contents calling to him with a pull he couldn't quite explain. He reached in and carefully extracted one of the journals, handling it with the reverence it deserved. The leather cover was embossed with initials he couldn't quite make out in the flickering firelight, and when he opened it, the pages crackled softly, brittle with age, but still legible. The handwriting was elegant, flowing, unmistakably feminine, and the first entry was dated March 15th, 1891. Jake did the quick mental calculation. That was over 30 years ago. Whoever had written these words was likely dead now or very old, and the life documented in these pages had long since passed into memory. He felt the weight of time pressing down on him as he began to read, his rough, calloused fingers careful not to damage the delicate pages. The journal belonged to a woman named Catherine Reeves, and from the very first entry, Jake was captivated by her voice. She wrote with intelligence and wit, painting vivid pictures of life on a Montana ranch with her husband Thomas and their young son Benjamin. Catherine described the brutal beauty of the mountains, the challenges of ranch life, and the deep love she felt for her family, with a clarity that made Jake's chest ache with recognition and loss. He had known that kind of love once with Mary. The way Catherine wrote about Thomas reminded Jake of his own wife, the way she had looked at him across the breakfast table, the sound of her laughter, the comfort of her presence at the end of long, hard days. Reading Catherine's words was like opening a door to his own past, to feelings he had carefully locked away because they hurt too much to examine. Midnight shifted in the corner, and Jake looked up from the journal, suddenly aware that he had been reading for over an hour. The fire had burned down, and he added more wood, watching the flames leap back to life. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating, and Jake settled back against the wall, the journal in his lap, and continued reading. Catherine's entries documented the rhythms of ranch life with remarkable detail. She wrote about spring calving, about the joy of watching Benjamin learn to ride his first pony, about the neighbors who lived 15 miles away but felt like family because frontier life demanded such bonds. She described harvest celebrations, Christmas gatherings where everyone brought what little they could spare, and summer evenings when the three of them would sit on their porch and watch the sun paint the mountains gold and purple. But as Jake turned the pages, he began to notice a change in Catherine's tone. The entries from late 1892 grew darker, more worried. There were references to tensions with neighboring ranchers, to disputes over water rights and grazing land. Thomas was mentioned less frequently, and when he appeared in the entries, Catherine wrote about him with concern rather than joy. He was staying out later, riding the property lines with increasing frequency, sleeping with a rifle beside the bed. Then came an entry from January 1893 that made Jake's blood run cold. Thomas had been shot. The details were sparse, Catherine's handwriting shaky and blotted with what Jake suspected were tears. He had been found near the northern boundary of their property, shot in the back, his horse standing guard over his body. The sheriff had called it an accident, a hunting mishap, but Catherine knew better. She wrote with bitter certainty that someone had murdered her husband, and she named the man she suspected, Marcus Holloway, a wealthy rancher who had been pressuring Thomas to sell their land for months. Jake felt his jaw tighten as he read. He had known men like Holloway, men who saw what they wanted and didn't care who they had to destroy to get it. The frontier was full of such men, hiding behind respectability while their hands were stained with blood and theft. The law was often too far away or too corrupt to deliver justice, and good people suffered while the ruthless prospered. The entries that followed Thomas's death were heartbreaking. Catherine struggled to run the ranch alone with young Benjamin, now 7 years old. She wrote about her fears, her determination to hold on to the land Thomas had died protecting, her rage at a system that seemed designed to favor men like Holloway. Other families offered help, but Catherine was proud, perhaps too proud, and she was determined to prove she could survive without charity. For months she managed. She hired seasonal workers when she could afford them, learned to handle cattle and horses with increasing skill, and taught Benjamin everything Thomas would have taught him. But then came an entry from October 1893 that shifted everything. Holloway had made her an offer, not for the land this time, but for something far more personal. He wanted to marry her. Jake felt disgust rise in his throat as he read Catherine's description of the encounter. Holloway had arrived at her ranch with expensive gifts and false sympathy, proposing marriage as if it were a generous rescue rather than the predatory advance it clearly was. He promised to care for her and Benjamin, to restore the ranch to prosperity, to give her the security she desperately needed. All she had to do was agree to become his wife and sign over the property rights. Catherine had refused, of course. Her entry describing the conversation was filled with barely controlled fury. She had called him what he was, a murderer and a thief, and told him she would rather lose everything than accept anything from the man who had killed her husband. Holloway had left with threats veiled as warnings, telling her that frontier life was dangerous for women alone, that accidents happened, that she should reconsider his generous offer before it was too late. Jake closed the journal for a moment, his hands shaking with anger on behalf of a woman he had never met, a woman who had faced such impossible choices over 30 years ago. He looked around the cabin, at the chest full of memories, and wondered what had become of Catherine Reeves. Had she survived? Had she managed to keep her land? Or had Holloway eventually gotten what he wanted? Outside, the storm raged on. Jake opened the journal again, unable to resist learning more about Catherine's fate. The fire crackled softly, casting warm light across the pages as he continued reading. The entries from late 1893 showed a woman under siege, not from open violence, but from the slow, methodical pressure that powerful men knew how to apply. Holloway had begun buying up the properties around Catherine's ranch, isolating her, cutting off potential allies and markets. Neighbors who had once been friendly grew distant, some out of fear, others because Holloway had made it worth their while. Catherine wrote about Benjamin with increasing worry. The boy was 8 now, old enough to understand that something was wrong, old enough to see his mother's fear even when she tried to hide it. She described how he had started sleeping with his father's old rifle beside his bed, how he would patrol the property line like a little soldier, and how that broke her heart more than anything Holloway had done. Her son was losing his childhood to fear and responsibility, and she felt powerless to stop it. Then came an entry that made Jake lean forward, his full attention captured by Catherine's words. She had discovered something, a document in Thomas's effects that she had overlooked in her grief. It was a survey map, professionally drawn, showing the water sources across their property and the surrounding land. But more importantly, it showed something Catherine hadn't known existed, a natural spring on their northern boundary that fed into the creek Holloway claimed as his own. According to the survey, that spring was entirely on Catherine's land, which meant Holloway's ranch had been drawing water illegally for years. Catherine wrote with barely contained excitement. This was leverage, proof that could bring Holloway down or at least force him to negotiate from a position of weakness rather than strength. She made plans to take the map to the county seat, to file a formal complaint, to finally strike back at the man who had stolen so much from her. The entry ended with something Jake hadn't seen in her recent writing: hope. But the next entry was dated 3 weeks later, and the tone was completely different. Catherine's handwriting was shaky, hurried, filled with urgency and fear. Men had come to the ranch, Holloway's men, claiming to be county officials conducting a property survey. They had been polite but thorough, going through the house while Catherine and Benjamin watched helplessly. When they left, the map was gone. Catherine knew they had been looking for it specifically, which meant someone had told Holloway about her discovery. She wrote about the betrayal she felt, trying to figure out who could have known about the map. She had told only one person, trusted one person with that information, her late husband's brother, James Reeves, who lived in the nearby town. James had been supportive since Thomas's death, helping with legal matters, offering advice. Catherine had shown him the map, asked his opinion on how to proceed, and now it was gone. She couldn't prove James had betrayed her, but the timing was impossible to ignore. Jake felt his anger building as he read. Family betrayal was perhaps the worst kind, the knife that cut deepest because you never saw it coming from someone who shared your blood. He thought about his own brother, dead now for 5 years, and wondered what he would have done in Catherine's position. Would he have confronted James? Would he have tried to recover the map? Or would he have done what Catherine seemed to be considering, as evidenced by her next entries? Catherine had decided to run. Not forever, she wrote, but long enough to regroup, to find another way to fight back, to keep Benjamin safe while she figured out her next move. She had this cabin, a hunting shelter Thomas had built years ago in the deep woods, far from their main ranch house. It was remote, accessible only by horseback along trails that most people didn't know existed. She would take Benjamin here, hide for a while, and plan her counterattack against Holloway. The entries that followed were written from this very cabin, Jake realized with a start. Catherine had sat where he was sitting now, had warmed herself by this same fireplace, had looked out at these same mountains and tried to figure out how to reclaim her life. She wrote about teaching Benjamin his lessons in the cabin, about hunting for food, about the strange peace she found in this isolation, despite the circumstances that had driven them here. She also wrote about the chest. She had brought it with her, filled with everything that mattered. The letters Thomas had written her during their courtship, photographs of happier times, Benjamin's baby clothes, the journal she had been keeping since her wedding day. If something happened to her, she wrote, at least these memories would survive. At least someone, someday, might find them and know that Catherine and Thomas Reeves had existed, had loved each other, had tried to build something good in this harsh country. Jake felt a lump forming in his throat. He was that someone, that person Catherine had written to across the decades, and the weight of that responsibility settled on him like a physical thing. He had to know what happened to her, had to follow her story to its conclusion, whatever that might be. The entries from the cabin covered several weeks. Catherine wrote about her growing determination to return and fight, about a plan forming in her mind. She had remembered something Thomas had told her years ago about keeping important documents in a safe place, somewhere even she didn't know about. She had thought it was paranoia at the time, but now she wondered if he had made copies of that survey map, if there was still evidence somewhere that could bring Holloway to justice. She planned to sneak back to the ranch house while Holloway's men weren't watching, to search through Thomas's things more carefully, to find whatever he might have hidden. Benjamin would stay at the cabin where he was safe, and Catherine would go alone. It was dangerous, perhaps foolish, but she had to try. The entry ended with instructions for Benjamin, how to survive if she didn't return, where to find help, how to protect himself. Jake turned the page, expecting to find an entry describing her return, but instead he found something that made his heart sink. The handwriting was different, childish and unsteady, clearly written by young Benjamin. The boy had dated it November 20th, 1893, and written simply, "Mama didn't come back." The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. He sat there in the firelit cabin, holding the journal of a dead woman, reading the heartbroken words of her son, and felt tears streaming down his face for the first time since Mary's funeral. This was real. These weren't characters in a story. These were real people who had suffered and lost and fought against impossible odds. Benjamin's entries were sparse and painful to read. He had waited at the cabin for 3 days before hunger drove him back to the ranch. His mother wasn't there. The house had been ransacked, torn apart as if someone had been searching for something. There was no sign of Catherine, no body, no explanation. She had simply vanished. The boy had gone to town, to his Uncle James, who had taken him in with expressions of shock and sympathy. There was a search, but Catherine was never found. The official story was that she had abandoned her son and run off, overwhelmed by the pressures of widowhood and ranch life. Some people claimed she had gone back east to family. Others whispered darker possibilities, but no one could prove anything. Holloway had acquired the Reeves Ranch 6 months later, buying it from James Reeves, who had become Benjamin's legal guardian and claimed the authority to sell. The boy wrote about watching his family's land transfer to the man who had destroyed everything, about feeling powerless and betrayed, about wanting revenge but being too young, too small, too helpless to do anything about it. The last entry in that particular journal was dated May 1894. Benjamin wrote that he was leaving, running away from his uncle's house, from the town that had failed his parents, from the memories that haunted him everywhere he turned. Jake set the journal aside carefully and reached back into the chest, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled out one of the bundled letters. The ribbon that bound them was faded to pale pink, and when he untied it, the fabric nearly disintegrated in his fingers. The envelopes were addressed to Catherine Reeves in a bold, masculine hand that Jake assumed belonged to Thomas. He selected one at random and slid out the letter inside, the paper so thin and delicate he feared it might crumble at his touch. The letter was dated June 1885, before Catherine and Thomas were married, clearly part of their courtship. Thomas wrote with surprising eloquence for a rancher, describing the land he was building his future on, the cabin he was constructing log by log with his own hands, the life he dreamed of sharing with Catherine if she would have him. He wrote about watching the sun rise over the mountains and wishing she were there to see it with him, about finding a meadow filled with wild flowers and imagining her walking through them in a white dress on their wedding day. Jake read several more letters, each one revealing the depth of love between Catherine and Thomas. These weren't people who had married for convenience or necessity. They had chosen each other, had built something real and precious, and that made the tragedy of Thomas's murder and Catherine's disappearance even more heartbreaking. They had deserved better than what fate and Marcus Holloway had dealt them. He returned the letters to their bundle and explored deeper in the chest. Beneath the journals and letters, wrapped in layers of oilcloth, he found a leather portfolio tied with string. Inside were legal documents: the deed to the Reeves Ranch, Catherine's marriage certificate, Benjamin's birth certificate, and several other papers that documented the official milestones of their family life. But tucked between these documents was something that made Jake's pulse quicken. It was a map, hand-drawn but detailed, showing property lines, water sources, and geographic features. Jake studied it carefully in the firelight, comparing what he saw to his knowledge of Montana geography. If he was reading it correctly, this was the area where he currently sat, which meant the Reeves Ranch had been somewhere nearby, possibly within a day's ride. And there, marked clearly on the map with Thomas's careful notation, was the natural spring Catherine had written about in her journal, the one that proved Holloway had been stealing water for years. This wasn't the original surveyor's map that had been stolen, Jake realized. This was Thomas's personal copy, a backup he had hidden away just as Catherine suspected. She had never found it, had gone back to the ranch looking for evidence, and walked into whatever trap had taken her life. But here it was, proof of Holloway's fraud, preserved by chance in a chest that Catherine had brought to this cabin for safekeeping. Jake's mind raced with possibilities. 30 years had passed since Catherine's disappearance, but if Holloway was still alive, if he still held the land he had stolen, this map could still matter. It could expose decades of illegal water use, could cast doubt on the legitimacy of his claim to the Reeves property. Justice delayed was not the same as justice denied, and Jake felt a burning need to see this wrong made right even after all these years. But there was more in the chest. Jake found a small wooden box, carved with intricate designs, and inside it was the wedding ring Catherine had mentioned in her journal, the one hanging from a delicate gold chain. He lifted it carefully, watching it catch the firelight, and wondered why she had removed it. Had it been too painful to wear after Thomas's death? Or had she taken it off for some other reason, perhaps before whatever final confrontation had claimed her life? Beneath the ring box, Jake found photographs. There were several tintype images in ornate frames, portraits of the family at different stages. Catherine was beautiful in the way that frontier women often were, strong-featured and clear-eyed, with a directness in her gaze that suggested she suffered no fools. Thomas was tall and broad-shouldered, with kind eyes and a gentle smile that contrasted with his imposing physical presence. And Benjamin, captured in a photograph that must have been taken shortly before his father's death, looked like a combination of both parents, serious and intelligent beyond his years. Jake studied the boy's face, trying to imagine what had become of him. Benjamin would be in his 40s now if he was still alive. Had he survived his time on the run? Had he made a life for himself somewhere? Or had the trauma of losing both parents destroyed him the way such things often destroyed children who had no one to protect them? The wind howled outside, reminding Jake that he was trapped in the cabin until the storm passed. Midnight shifted in the corner, settled and warm, unconcerned by the tale of tragedy unfolding in Jake's hands. The horse had the wisdom to live in the present, unburdened by the past or worried about the future. Jake envied that simplicity, even as he found himself unable to let go of Catherine's story. He pulled out another journal, this one smaller and more worn than the first. When he opened it, he was surprised to find that the handwriting was different, masculine and unsteady, clearly written by someone whose hands were more accustomed to physical labor than penmanship. The first entry was dated July 1899, 5 years after Benjamin's final entry in his mother's journal, and the voice was unmistakably that of the boy grown into young manhood. Benjamin wrote about his years on the run, about working on ranches across Montana and Wyoming under assumed names, about the anger that had festered inside him, growing from a boy's helpless rage into a man's calculated fury. He had spent those 5 years learning everything he could about ranching, about horses and cattle, about guns and fighting, preparing himself for the day when he would be strong enough to return and claim what was rightfully his. But more importantly, Benjamin wrote about what he had discovered during his wandering. In a saloon in Cheyenne, he had met an old surveyor who remembered the Reeves property, who had worked with Thomas years before his death. The man had been drunk and talkative, and he had told Benjamin something that changed everything. Marcus Holloway had paid him to alter the original survey, to hide the existence of that crucial spring, to create the legal fiction that justified Holloway's water claims. The surveyor had lived with that guilt for years, and in his drunken confession he had given Benjamin something precious, a signed statement admitting to the fraud, dated and detailed enough to hold up in court if anyone had the courage to challenge Holloway. Benjamin had that statement now, hidden away somewhere safe, and he was planning his return to Montana with the careful precision of a military campaign. Jake read through Benjamin's plans with growing admiration and concern. The young man was smart, methodical, determined to do this right rather than simply seeking violent revenge. He planned to gather allies, build a legal case, expose Holloway's crimes in a way that would destroy him completely. But there was also darkness in Benjamin's words, a hardness that came from years of loss and isolation, and Jake worried about what that darkness might drive him to do. The entries documented Benjamin's return to Montana in late 1899. He had taken a job on a ranch 50 miles from his former home, using a false name, biding his time and gathering information. He wrote about watching Holloway from a distance, about seeing the ranch that should have been his family's legacy, about the rage that burned in his chest every time he laid eyes on the man who had destroyed his parents. But Benjamin also wrote about doubt. He was 21 years old, alone in the world, carrying evidence that could bring down a powerful man, but uncertain whether anyone would believe him or care about crimes committed so long ago. The frontier had a short memory for injustice, especially when the victims were gone and the perpetrator was wealthy and connected. Benjamin questioned whether justice was even possible, or if he should simply take his revenge in a more direct and final manner. The last entry in this journal was dated December 1899, and it contained a decision that made Jake's blood run cold. Benjamin had decided to confront Holloway directly, not with violence, but with the truth. He wrote about his plan to walk into Holloway's ranch house on Christmas Day, when the man would likely be entertaining guests, and present him with the evidence of his crimes in front of witnesses who could not be bought or intimidated. It was bold to the point of recklessness, but Benjamin believed it was his only chance to force justice from a system that had failed his family. Jake set the journal down and reached for another, hoping to find out what had happened during that confrontation. But the next journal he pulled from the chest was different from the others. The leather cover was newer, less worn, and when he opened it, he found entries dated from just 5 years ago, written in an older hand that he recognized as Benjamin's, though matured and steadied by decades. Benjamin had survived. That realization sent relief flooding through Jake's chest. Whatever had happened on that Christmas day in 1899, it hadn't ended with the young man's death. Jake began reading eagerly, hungry to understand how the story had unfolded, what had become of Holloway, and why this chest of memories sat in an abandoned cabin instead of in Benjamin's possession. The entries revealed a truth far more complex than Jake had imagined. Benjamin had indeed confronted Holloway on Christmas Day, had stood in the man's parlor surrounded by the elite of Montana society, and presented his evidence. But Holloway had been prepared. The surveyor who had given Benjamin that signed confession had been found dead 2 weeks before Christmas, killed in what was ruled an unfortunate accident involving his horse. Without the surveyor alive to testify, the written statement became questionable, potentially forged, impossible to verify. More damning still, Benjamin's uncle James had appeared at the confrontation with his own documents, legal papers showing that Catherine had signed over guardianship of Benjamin and control of the ranch to James before her disappearance. The signature looked authentic, the papers were notarized, and they created a legal framework that justified everything that had happened afterward. Benjamin had no proof the documents were forged, and James, standing there with tears in his eyes, had played the role of grieving brother perfectly. Benjamin wrote about the humiliation of that moment, standing in front of Montana's wealthy elite, being painted as a bitter young man inventing wild conspiracy theories to claim an inheritance that was never his. Holloway had been magnanimous in victory, offering to give Benjamin a job on the ranch, to let him work the land his father had once owned, as if this were kindness rather than cruelty. Benjamin had refused and left that Christmas gathering with nothing but his rage and his broken dreams. But he hadn't given up. The entries that followed chronicled Benjamin's life over the next 25 years, a story of patient, methodical revenge that took a very different form than Jake had expected. Benjamin had left Montana and made his fortune in Colorado, buying silver mines and building a business empire through sheer determination and brilliance. He had married, had children of his own, and built a respectable life far from the land that held his painful memories. Yet he never forgot. Benjamin wrote about hiring investigators to track Holloway's business dealings, about documenting every questionable transaction, every suspicious land acquisition, every pattern of intimidation and fraud that marked the man's rise to power. He had accumulated evidence slowly, carefully, building a case that would be undeniable even to the corrupt officials who had protected Holloway for so long. And then, in 1920, Benjamin had gotten his chance. The federal government had begun investigating water rights across the Western Territories, and Benjamin had provided them with everything he had gathered. The case against Holloway had been solid, built on decades of documented fraud, and the legal machinery had finally ground forward toward justice. But Holloway had died before he could be brought to trial. A heart attack, sudden and final, had claimed him in his sleep at the age of 73. Benjamin wrote about receiving the news with mixed emotions, relief that the man was gone, tempered by disappointment that he would never face public disgrace or legal punishment for his crimes. Justice had come, but not in the form Benjamin had spent 30 years working toward. The ranch had been sold to pay Holloway's debts, the legal fees from fighting the government investigation. A new family owned it now, people with no connection to the dark history that had unfolded there. Benjamin had considered buying it himself, reclaiming his family's legacy, but in the end, he had decided against it. The land held too much pain, too many ghosts, and his life was in Colorado now with his wife and children, who knew nothing of his tragic childhood. Instead, Benjamin had done something else. He had tracked down this cabin, the place where his mother had hidden with him during those final weeks before her disappearance. It had been abandoned for decades, slowly being reclaimed by the forest, but the structure was still sound. Benjamin had restored it, not to live in, but as a memorial to his parents, a place where their memory could rest undisturbed. He had brought the chest here, filled with all the letters and journals and photographs that documented his family's story. This was their shrine, their testament, proof that Catherine and Thomas Reeves had existed, had loved each other, had fought against injustice even when it cost them everything. Benjamin wrote about visiting the cabin once a year, usually in October around the anniversary of his mother's disappearance, to read through the journals and remember. The most recent entries were from just last year, and they carried a tone of finality that made Jake uneasy. Benjamin wrote about his failing health, about the cancer that was slowly claiming him just as it had claimed Jake's own wife. He knew he didn't have much time left, and he was making arrangements for what would happen after his death. His children knew nothing about the cabin or the chest. Benjamin had decided to leave it that way. They had their own lives in Colorado, modern lives unburdened by the tragedies of the past, and he didn't want to weigh them down with stories of grandparents they had never met and injustices they couldn't fix. The cabin would remain hidden, the chest would stay where it was, and eventually, someone would find it, just as Catherine had written about all those years ago. Benjamin's final entry was addressed to that unknown finder, to Jake, though Benjamin could never have known who would eventually stumble upon this place. He wrote about the importance of memory, about how the dead live on only as long as someone remembers their stories. He asked whoever found the chest to treat its contents with respect, to understand that these were not just objects but pieces of human souls preserved in paper and ink. And then Benjamin made a request that hit Jake like a physical blow. If the finder felt moved to do so, Benjamin asked that they visit his grave in Denver and tell him that his parents' story had been found, that Catherine and Thomas Reeves were not forgotten. He included detailed directions to the cemetery, the location of his family plot, and the words he hoped someone might speak over his resting place. Jake sat in the fire-lit cabin, tears streaming down his weathered face, holding a dead man's final wish in his hands. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside, Jake felt something shifting in his chest, a purpose crystallizing from the grief and loneliness that had defined his life since Mary's death. He had been drifting for years, moving from ranch to ranch, from job to job with no destination and no reason beyond simple survival. But now he had a reason. He had a story to honor and a promise to keep, even if that promise had been made to a stranger across the gulf of years and death. Jake spent the rest of the night reading through the remaining contents of the chest. There were more letters, some from Catherine's family back east, pleading with her to bring Benjamin and return to civilization after Thomas's death, others from neighbors offering condolences and help that had come too late. There were receipts and bills from the ranch, mundane records of daily life that somehow felt sacred now that he understood the context in which they had been saved. He found a small leather pouch containing locks of hair, carefully labeled in Catherine's handwriting. Thomas's hair, dark and thick. Benjamin's baby hair, fine and light. And Catherine's own, a rich auburn that must have been beautiful in the sunlight. These physical remnants of people long dead moved Jake in ways the words had not, making their existence feel tangible and real in a way that transcended the years that separated him from them. Dawn came slowly, the storm finally beginning to ease as gray light filtered through the cabin's small windows. Jake had not slept, but he didn't feel tired. Instead, he felt energized by a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. He carefully returned everything to the chest except for Benjamin's final journal, which he tucked into his coat pocket. He would need the directions to the cemetery in Denver, and he wanted to read Benjamin's words again, to make sure he understood exactly what the man had hoped for from whoever found this place. Midnight stood and stretched, clearly ready to leave the cabin now that the storm had passed. Jake walked to the door and pushed it open, struggling against the snow that had piled against it during the night. When he finally forced it wide enough to step through, he was greeted by a world transformed. Snow blanketed everything in pristine white, smoothing the rough edges of the landscape and making the forest look like something from a fairy tale. The beauty of it struck him hard. Catherine and Thomas had lived here, had seen mornings like this, had probably stood in this very spot and marveled at nature's ability to make even the harshest wilderness look gentle and pure. Benjamin had played in snow like this as a child, building forts and throwing snowballs before his world fell apart. The continuity of it, the way the land remained beautiful regardless of human tragedy, felt both comforting and cruel. Jake knew he couldn't ride out yet. The snow was too deep, and he needed to give the trails time to become passable. He spent the morning clearing snow from around the cabin, gathering more firewood, and melting snow to provide water for himself and Midnight. The physical labor felt good, grounding him after the emotional intensity of the night's discoveries. As he worked, his mind turned over the question of what to do with what he had learned. Benjamin's request was clear: visit his grave and tell him his parents' story had been found. But Jake felt pulled to do more than that. This story deserved to be told, to be shared, to become part of the historical record, rather than remaining hidden in an abandoned cabin that might not survive another harsh winter. He thought about writing to historical societies, about finding Benjamin's descendants despite the man's wishes to keep them uninvolved, about ensuring that Catherine and Thomas Reeves were not forgotten by history. But he also understood Benjamin's desire to let his children live unburdened by the past. There was wisdom in knowing when to let go, when to allow the dead to rest, rather than dragging their tragedies into the light. By afternoon, Jake had made his decision. He would honor Benjamin's request first, making the journey to Denver to visit the grave and speak the words Benjamin had hoped someone would say. After that, he would decide what else, if anything, needed to be done. The story would guide him, he felt certain. The right path would become clear once he had fulfilled his obligation to the man who had preserved these memories for so long. He spent the rest of the day preparing for departure. He checked Midnight's hooves carefully, making sure the cold hadn't caused any problems. He repacked his saddlebags, redistributing weight to make room for the one item he had decided to take with him: a single photograph of Catherine, Thomas, and Benjamin together, taken in happier times. It seemed wrong to leave without carrying some physical piece of their story with him. The chest remained in the cabin, just as Benjamin had left it. Jake felt strongly that it should stay here in the memorial Benjamin had created. This was its proper home, the place where Catherine had sought refuge and where Benjamin had chosen to honor his parents' memory. Moving it would feel like desecration, like disturbing a grave. But Jake couldn't leave the cabin unprotected. not knowing what he now knew about its contents. He spent the evening reinforcing the door, securing the windows, doing what he could to keep scavengers and weather from damaging the structure. It was crude protection, but it was something, a way of showing respect for the sanctuary Benjamin had created. That night, Jake slept fitfully, his dreams full of people he had never met but felt he knew intimately. He dreamed of Catherine searching frantically through her ransacked house for Thomas's hidden map, unaware that men were watching from the shadows. He dreamed of young Benjamin huddled in this cabin, waiting for a mother who would never return. He dreamed of Thomas falling from his horse, a bullet in his back, his final thoughts of the wife and son he was leaving unprotected. But he also dreamed of happier times, scenes drawn from the letters and journals he had read. Catherine and Thomas dancing at their wedding, laughing as they spun across a rough wooden floor. Benjamin, as a toddler, taking his first steps into his father's waiting arms. The three of them sitting on their porch on a summer evening, watching the sun paint the mountains gold, secure in the belief that they had many years ahead of them to enjoy such simple pleasures. When morning came, Jake rose with the sun and prepared to leave. He saddled Midnight carefully, double-checking every strap and buckle. The journey to Denver would take weeks, maybe longer, depending on weather and how much work he could find along the way to pay for supplies. But time didn't matter. He had nowhere else to be, nothing else pulling him in any direction. This quest, this obligation to strangers long dead, had become his purpose. Before mounting Midnight, Jake walked back to the cabin one final time. He stood in the doorway looking at the chest in the corner, at the fireplace where he had spent that transformative night, reading about lives that had touched his own across the decades. He spoke aloud, feeling foolish but compelled to do it anyway. "I'll keep your promise, Benjamin. I'll tell your story. I'll make sure your parents are remembered." The words echoed in the empty cabin, and Jake imagined he could feel approval in the silence that followed. Then he closed the door gently, mounted Midnight, and turned the stallion's head toward Denver. The snow crunched under the horses' hooves as they rode away from the cabin, away from the memorial, toward whatever waited at the end of this unexpected journey. Behind him, the cabin stood silent and strong, guardian of memories that had changed everything for a lonely cowboy who had stumbled upon them in a storm. Ahead, the mountains rose against a clear blue sky, beautiful and indifferent, unchanged by human drama. And Jake rode between past and future, carrying the weight of other people's stories and finding in that weight something he had lost when Mary died, a reason to care about tomorrow. The journey to Denver took Jake through country he had never seen before, winding mountain passes that opened onto broad valleys, forests so dense they blocked out the midday sun, and stretches of prairie that reminded him painfully of the land where he and Mary had once dreamed of building their future. Every mile carried him farther from the cabin and closer to the grave of a man he had never met, but felt bound to by something stronger than blood or friendship. He found work where he could, spending a week at a ranch in northern Wyoming helping with the last of the fall roundup. Then another few days at a way station repairing fences in exchange for hot meals and shelter. The work was familiar and comforting, the rhythm of physical labor giving his hands something to do while his mind continued processing everything he had learned in that cabin. At night, around campfires or in bunkhouses, he would pull out Benjamin's journal and read passages again, finding new meaning in words he had already absorbed. The other cowboys he encountered were curious about the photograph Jake carried, the image of Catherine, Thomas, and Benjamin that he kept wrapped in oilcloth in his saddlebag. When they asked, Jake told them the story, or parts of it, testing how the words felt in his mouth, seeing how others reacted to the tale of love and loss and injustice that had consumed his thoughts for weeks now. Most listened with the polite attention people give to any story told well around a fire, then moved on to other topics or turned to their bedrolls for sleep. But a few responded differently, their eyes sharpening with recognition. their questions becoming more pointed and personal. These were men who had their own stories of frontier injustice, of powerful men crushing those who stood in their way, of families destroyed by greed disguised as legitimate business. One man, a grizzled cowboy named Charlie, who must have been in his 60s, listened to Jake's telling with tears streaming down his weathered face. When Jake finished, Charlie told his own story about a brother killed over a water dispute, about a sheriff who had been paid to call it an accident, about spending 40 years trying to drink away the guilt of surviving when his brother had not. The parallel to Benjamin's story was unmistakable, and Jake realized that Catherine and Thomas's tragedy was not unique, but rather one example of a pattern that had repeated across the West countless times. That conversation changed something in Jake's understanding of what he was carrying. This was not just one family's story, but a testament to all the forgotten victims of frontier expansion, all the people whose names never made it into history books because they died before they could write their own narratives. By honoring Benjamin's request, Jake was honoring all of them, giving voice to the voiceless and memory to the forgotten. As December settled over the land, Jake reached the outskirts of Denver. The city had grown substantially since the last time he had passed through, sprawling outward with new buildings and paved streets that spoke of progress and permanence. It felt jarring after weeks of wilderness and small settlements, the noise and crowds pressing in on him like physical things. Midnight was nervous too, his ears flicking constantly at unfamiliar sounds, his muscles tense beneath Jake's saddle. Jake found a stable willing to board Midnight for a reasonable price, then secured a room at a modest boarding house on the edge of the city. The landlady was a widow named Mrs. Chen who reminded him of Mary in small ways, the tilt of her head when she listened, the efficient way she moved through her domain. She served him dinner that first night, beef stew and fresh bread, and asked no questions beyond his name and how long he planned to stay. "I'm not sure," Jake admitted, the first honest answer he had given anyone in weeks. "I have some business to attend to, a promise to keep. When it's done, I'll know whether I'm staying or moving on." Mrs. Chen had nodded as if this made perfect sense, as if men showed up at her boarding house all the time with mysterious promises to keep. Perhaps they did. Denver was that kind of city, a place where people came to reinvent themselves or tie up loose ends from lives lived elsewhere. The next morning, Jake walked to the cemetery Benjamin had described in his journal. It was a large place, well-maintained, with neat rows of headstones marching up a hillside that overlooked the city. He found the Reeves family plot after 20 minutes of searching, guided by Benjamin's careful directions and the distinctive oak tree that marked the eastern boundary of their section. Benjamin Reeves lay buried next to his wife, Eleanor, who had died 3 years before him. Their children had placed a beautiful headstone over his grave, black granite polished to a mirror shine, engraved with words that spoke of a loving husband and father, a successful businessman, a pillar of the Denver community. There was no mention of Montana, of murdered parents, of a childhood stolen by violence and greed. Jake stood before the grave for a long time, the photograph of Benjamin's family clutched in his hand, trying to find the words Benjamin had hoped someone would speak. The journal had been specific about what he wanted said, but now that Jake was here, the formal phrases felt inadequate to the task. How could he sum up everything he had learned, everything he had felt in a few carefully rehearsed sentences? Instead, Jake began to talk, telling Benjamin the story of how he had found the cabin, describing the storm that had driven him there, the hours spent reading by firelight, the way Catherine's words had reached across decades to touch a stranger's heart. He talked about the chest and its contents, about the care with which Benjamin had preserved his parents' memory, about the love that radiated from every letter and journal entry. He told Benjamin about the other cowboys he had met on his journey, about Charlie and his murdered brother, about all the untold stories of frontier injustice that Benjamin's own tragedy represented. He promised that the cabin would be protected, that the chest would remain undisturbed, that Catherine and Thomas Reeves would not be forgotten as long as Jake drew breath. As he spoke, Jake became aware of someone standing nearby, a woman perhaps in her 40s watching him with curiosity and something that might have been recognition. She was well dressed in the manner of Denver's prosperous class, her coat trimmed with fur, her gloved hands holding a bouquet of winter flowers. When Jake paused in his monologue, suddenly self-conscious about talking to a gravestone while a stranger watched, she spoke. "You knew my father?" Her voice was soft but clear, carrying an educated accent that reminded Jake of Catherine's elegant handwriting. "You're speaking about things he never told us, about Montana and his parents. I'm Sarah Reeves Coleman, Benjamin's eldest daughter." Jake felt his heart hammer in his chest. Benjamin had wanted his children kept separate from this story, had deliberately chosen not to burden them with the tragedies of his past. But here was Sarah, listening to Jake pour out the very history her father had tried to protect her from. He had no idea what to say, how to explain his presence or justify his intrusion into her family's private grief. "I'm sorry," Jake managed finally. "I didn't mean to disturb you. I found something that belonged to your father, something he left in Montana many years ago. I came to tell him I had found it, to let him know his parents' story was not forgotten. That's what he asked for in his journal." Sarah's eyes widened, and she stepped closer, studying Jake's face with an intensity that reminded him of the way Catherine had looked in her photograph, direct and unflinching. "My father kept journals. In Montana. We knew he had lived there as a child, but he never spoke of it. He always said the past was better left buried." The irony of those words struck Jake hard. Benjamin had left the chest as a memorial, had asked for someone to acknowledge his parents' story, but he had also kept his children deliberately ignorant of the very history he wanted preserved. It was a contradiction Jake didn't fully understand, a complicated relationship with memory and legacy that spoke to traumas too deep to easily heal. Jake found himself in an impossible position, standing between Benjamin's explicit wishes and his daughter's obvious hunger for the truth about her father's past. He could see the questions forming in Sarah's eyes, the desperate need to understand the man who had raised her, but kept such essential parts of himself hidden. He thought about walking away, about protecting Benjamin's secrets the way the man himself had chosen to do. But something in Sarah's expression stopped him, a look he recognized from his own mirror in the years after Mary's death, the look of someone carrying unanswered questions that haunted their quiet moments. "Perhaps we could talk somewhere more private," Jake suggested, gesturing toward the cemetery gates. "This is a long story, and your father left specific instructions about how he wanted it handled. I think you should hear it all before you decide what to do with it." Sarah nodded and led him to a tea room 2 blocks from the cemetery, a refined establishment where well-dressed women gathered to discuss society matters over delicate china cups. Jake felt distinctly out of place in his trail-worn clothes and dusty boots, but Sarah seemed not to notice or care. She ordered tea for them both, then fixed Jake with a steady gaze that reminded him powerfully of the photograph of young Benjamin, serious and determined beyond his years. "Tell me everything," she said simply, and Jake did. He started with the storm in the cabin, describing the chest and its contents in careful detail. He spoke about Catherine's journals, about the love story between her and Thomas, about the murder and the betrayal and the disappeared mother who had never returned to her young son. Sarah listened without interrupting, her hands wrapped around her teacup, her knuckles white with the force of her grip. When Jake described Benjamin's later journals, the young man's determination to seek justice, the confrontation with Holloway that had ended in humiliation rather than vindication, Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a handkerchief, dabbing at her face with quick, almost angry motions, as if upset at herself for showing emotion. "He never told us any of this," she said when Jake paused to drink his tea. "He was a wonderful father, loving and present, but there was always something distant about him, something we could never quite reach. Mother used to say he kept a room in his heart that no one was allowed to enter. I always wondered what he was protecting us from." Jake pulled the photograph from his coat pocket and slid it across the table. Sarah picked it up with trembling hands, studying the faces of grandparents she had never known existed. The resemblance was striking. Benjamin had his father's build and his mother's eyes, and Sarah herself had inherited Catherine's strong features and direct gaze. "They look happy here," Sarah whispered, tracing her finger over the image, before everything fell apart. "My father carried this much pain his entire life and never shared it with anyone." "He shared it with the cabin," Jake said gently. "He created a place where their memory could live, where he could visit them once a year and remember. That took courage, to hold on to that pain rather than letting it destroy him, to build a good life for you and your siblings despite everything he had lost." Sarah set the photograph down carefully, her expression thoughtful. "He was protecting us," she said slowly, working through the realization as she spoke. "He didn't want us to carry his anger, his grief, his need for revenge. He wanted us to have the childhood he never got, free from fear and trauma and the weight of injustice." "That's what I believe," Jake agreed. His final journal entry made it clear he wanted the story preserved but not inflicted on the living. He hoped someone would find it someday and bear witness, but he didn't want that burden falling on his children. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her tea growing cold in front of her. When she finally spoke, her voice was firm with decision. "I want to see the cabin. I want to read my grandmother's words myself, to understand where I came from. Will you take me there?" The request surprised Jake. He had expected her to ask for the journals to be brought to Denver, to want the chest moved to somewhere she could access it easily. But Sarah was asking for something more meaningful, to make the pilgrimage her father had made every year, to stand in the place where Catherine had hidden with young Benjamin and feel the weight of history in her bones. "It's weeks of hard travel," Jake warned. "The cabin is remote, accessible only by horseback, and winter is settling in. The journey would be difficult and potentially dangerous." Sarah's chin lifted in a gesture Jake had seen in Catherine's photograph, stubborn determination that would not be denied. "I don't care. My father made that journey every year until he was too sick to ride. I can manage it once. Besides," she added with a slight smile, "I'm not as delicate as I look. I rode competitively when I was younger, and I've camped in the mountains. I'm my father's daughter, after all." Jake found himself smiling back, recognizing the spirit that had allowed Catherine to survive as a widow on the frontier, that had driven Benjamin to build an empire from nothing. This family had strength running through its bloodline, resilience that survived even when individuals did not. They spent the rest of the afternoon making plans. Sarah would need to make arrangements with her family to prepare proper clothing and equipment for the journey. Jake would secure supplies and scout the best route given the winter conditions. They agreed to meet in a week's time, which would give Sarah time to settle her affairs, and Jake time to ensure Midnight was well rested and ready for the return trip. As they parted on the street outside the tea room, Sarah reached out and took Jake's hand in both of hers. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for honoring my father's memory, for caring about people you never met. You've given me a gift I didn't even know I needed." Jake squeezed her hands gently, thinking about Mary and the gifts she had given him, the memories that had sustained him through years of loneliness. "We all need our stories," he said quietly. "We all need to know where we came from and who loved us before we arrived. Your grandmother understood that. She wrote those journals hoping someone would read them someday, and know that she existed, that she loved and was loved. That week passed in a blur of preparation. Jake bought supplies, checked and rechecked his gear, and spent time with Midnight, preparing the Stallion for the long journey back to Montana. He also visited a lawyer and had a document drawn up, a legal agreement that would protect the cabin and its contents, ensuring that it remained undisturbed except by Sarah and any descendants she chose to share it with. On the appointed morning, Sarah arrived at the stable dressed in practical riding clothes, leading a sturdy mare that looked capable of handling mountain trails. She had packed efficiently, bringing only what was necessary, and Jake could see she had not exaggerated her outdoor experience. This was not a society woman playing at frontier adventure, but someone who genuinely understood what the journey would require. They rode out of Denver as the sun rose. Two people bound together by a story neither of them had lived, but both of them carried. Behind them, the city continued its morning routines, thousands of people going about their lives unaware that a piece of frontier history was being honored by the granddaughter who had never known it existed, and the cowboy who had stumbled upon it in a storm. The journey north was slower than Jake's trip south had been. Sarah was a competent rider, but she was not accustomed to full days in the saddle, and Jake set a pace that would get them to their destination without exhausting her. They talked as they rode, Sarah sharing stories about her father's life in Denver, the businesses he had built, the philanthropic work he had done, the way he had loved his family with quiet intensity. Jake shared his own story in return, telling Sarah about Mary and the ranch they had lost, about the years of drifting that had followed, about the loneliness that had consumed him until that storm drove him to the cabin. There was something healing in the telling, in having someone listen who understood loss and the complicated relationship people maintained with their memories. The mountains welcomed them back with clear skies and temperatures cold enough to freeze their breath into clouds of white vapor. They had been traveling for nearly 3 weeks, taking their time, allowing Sarah to adjust to the rigors of trail life. Jake watched her transform during those weeks, the polished Denver society woman gradually giving way to someone harder and more elemental, someone who reminded him increasingly of the woman in those old photographs. On the evening before they would reach the cabin, they made camp in a sheltered valley surrounded by pine trees heavy with snow. Jake built a fire while Sarah tended to the horses, working with the easy competence she had developed over their journey. They ate a simple meal of beans and coffee, then sat in companionable silence watching the flames dance against the darkness. "I'm afraid," Sarah admitted suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Afraid of what I'll feel when I read her words, when I see the place where my father hid as a child while his mother was being murdered. I spent my whole life not knowing these people, and now I'm about to meet them through their own writings. What if it changes everything I thought I knew about myself?" Jake understood the fear. He had felt something similar that night in the cabin, the sense of being fundamentally altered by contact with lives that had ended before he was born. "Change is already here," he said gently. "The moment I told you their story, you became different from the person you were. Reading the journals will just deepen what's already begun." Sarah nodded, pulling her blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Tell me something," she said after a moment. "Why did you come to Denver? You could have honored my father's request by simply visiting the grave and leaving. You didn't have to involve yourself further, didn't have to bring me into this." Jake considered the question, trying to understand his own motivations. "I think I was lonely," he said finally. "I've been alone since my wife died, moving from place to place with no real purpose. Your father's story gave me something to care about, someone to remember besides Mary. When I met you at the cemetery, I saw a chance to do more than just bear witness. I saw a chance to connect the past with the present, to make those memories living things instead of dusty relics in a forgotten cabin." "And now?" Sarah asked. "After we visit the cabin, after I've read the journals, what will you do?" I don't know, Jake admitted. For the first time in years, I have no idea what comes next, and that doesn't terrify me the way it once would have. Maybe that's what your grandmother's story gave me. Permission to live in uncertainty, to not have all the answers planned out. They reached the cabin late the following afternoon, approaching it from the same direction Jake had come during the storm. The clearing looked different in daylight, more ordinary and less mysterious, but Sarah gasped when she saw the log structure emerge from the trees. She dismounted quickly, her hands shaking as she tied her mare's reins to a branch, and stood staring at the cabin as if it might vanish if she looked away. "My father built this," she whispered. "Or rather, my grandfather built it, and my father restored it. It's the only thing left standing that they both touched." Jake led her inside, and Sarah's emotional reaction to the interior space was immediate and overwhelming. She sank to her knees in front of the chest, her hands hovering over its surface without quite touching it, tears streaming down her face. "This was real," she said brokenly. All of it was real, and I never knew, never even suspected." Jake started a fire in the hearth, giving Sarah time to compose herself. When the flames were burning steadily, he retrieved the chest and carried it closer to the firelight. Together they opened it, and Sarah gasped at the wealth of memories inside. She reached for her grandmother's first journal with reverent hands, and Jake watched as she began to read. Hours passed. Sarah read with complete absorption, occasionally pausing to wipe tears from her eyes or to ask Jake questions about timeline or geography. She examined the letters between Catherine and Thomas, smiling through her tears at the evidence of their love. She studied the photographs, tracing the faces of grandparents she had never met, finding echoes of her own features and her father's in their images. When she reached the entries about Thomas's murder and Catherine's growing desperation, Sarah's grief was palpable. She read aloud sometimes, her voice breaking on particularly painful passages, and Jake found himself crying alongside her, mourning these people for the second time. The shared grief created a bond between them, a connection forged in witness to tragedy and resilience. Sarah spent special time with Benjamin's journals, reading her father's words from adolescence and young manhood with a mixture of sorrow and pride. She learned about the man he had been before Denver, before Eleanor, before the successful businessman and loving father she had known. She saw his pain and his rage, his determination to seek justice, and his eventual decision to build a life that honored his parents' memory without being consumed by their tragedy. The sun set and rose again, and still Sarah read. Jake dozed by the fire, waking periodically to add wood or check on the horses, giving Sarah the space she needed to absorb her family history. Finally, as afternoon light slanted through the cabin windows, Sarah closed the last journal and sat back, exhausted, but somehow lighter, as if she had set down a burden she hadn't known she was carrying. "I understand now," she said quietly, "why my father kept this separate, why he visited once a year but never brought us here. He was protecting us from his pain, but he was also protecting their memory from being diluted or dismissed. This place is sacred. These journals are sacred. They deserve to exist apart from the everyday world." Jake nodded, relieved that she understood. "What will you do now? Will you tell your siblings?" Sarah was quiet for a long time, considering. "I think I need to honor my father's wishes as much as possible. My brothers and sisters have their own lives, their own understanding of who father was. Learning about this might help them, or it might just burden them with grief for people they never knew." She touched the journals gently. "But I will come back, every year like father did. I will read these words and remember, and I will teach my children about Catherine and Thomas Reeves, about the price they paid for loving each other and standing against injustice." That night, they sat together in the cabin much as Jake had sat alone during the storm, the fire crackling softly, The journals and letters spread around them like pieces of a puzzle finally assembled into coherence. Sarah held the photograph of her grandparents and father, studying it in the firelight, committing every detail to memory. "Thank you," she said to Jake, not for the first time. "Thank you for bringing me here, for sharing this with me. You've given me roots I didn't know I was missing. You gave me something too," Jake replied. "You reminded me that stories matter, that remembering the dead keeps them alive in ways that matter. I was so focused on surviving Mary's loss that I forgot the importance of honoring it, of letting it mean something beyond just pain." They fell silent, comfortable in each other's company, surrounded by the accumulated memories of lives lived fully despite tragedy. Outside, the Montana wilderness stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful and harsh and indifferent to human drama. But inside the cabin, warmth and remembrance created a space where the dead could speak and the living could listen. They stayed at the cabin for 3 days, Sarah reading and rereading passages from the journals, while Jake maintained the fire and cared for the horses. On the morning of the 4th day, Sarah carefully returned everything to the chest, arranging each item with the reverence it deserved. She ran her fingers over the wooden surface one final time, then closed the lid with a soft click that sounded like a promise being sealed. Before they left, Sarah asked Jake to help her with one more task. Together, they carved Catherine and Thomas's names into a wooden plank, along with their dates and a simple epitaph Sarah composed. They loved deeply and fought bravely. They mounted the plank above the cabin door, creating a marker that would tell any future visitor that this place meant something, that it was more than just an abandoned shelter in the woods. The journey back to Denver was different from the journey to the cabin. Sarah rode with the quiet confidence of someone who had found what they were looking for, who had connected with a part of themselves they hadn't known was missing. She talked about her plans to establish a trust that would protect the cabin and its contents, to ensure that future generations of her family would have access to this piece of their history. Jake listened and nodded, pleased that Sarah was taking responsibility for preserving her family's legacy. But he also felt the familiar tug of restlessness returning, the awareness that his role in this story was coming to an end. He had fulfilled Benjamin's request, had helped Sarah connect with her past, and now it was time to figure out what came next for a cowboy approaching 50 with no ties and no clear direction. As they descended from the mountains into the foothills, Sarah brought up something that had clearly been on her mind. "I've been thinking," she said, her tone careful and measured. "My father built a successful business in Denver, and my brothers run most of it now. But we've been considering expanding into Montana, possibly acquiring ranch land for cattle operations. The territory is opening up, and there are opportunities for people who understand both the old ways and the new business methods." Jake glanced at her, sensing where this was heading. "You're offering me a job." Sarah smiled. "I'm offering you a partnership. Someone with your experience could help us establish operations here, could train younger workers, could bridge the gap between the traditional ranching my grandfather knew and the more modern approaches we need to succeed." She paused, then added more softly, "And it would mean you'd be near the cabin, could visit it when you wanted, could continue being part of this story." The offer was generous, almost too generous, and Jake's first instinct was to refuse. He had spent years avoiding exactly this kind of commitment, exactly this kind of connection that might lead to caring too much and losing too much. But as he looked at Sarah, at the hope in her expression, he realized that running from connection had not protected him from pain. It had only guaranteed loneliness. "I'd need to think about it," he said finally. "That's a big decision, putting down roots after all these years of drifting." "Of course," Sarah replied. "Take all the time you need. The offer will remain open." They reached Denver in early January, the city bustling with New Year activity and fresh snow coating the streets. Sarah invited Jake to stay at her family home while he considered her offer, and he accepted, curious to meet the people Benjamin had raised, to see the life the man had built after leaving Montana behind. Sarah's family welcomed Jake with warmth and curiosity. Her husband, Robert, was a kind man who clearly adored his wife and understood that her journey to the cabin had been important even if he didn't fully grasp all the details. Their 3 children, ranging in age from 8 to 15, listened wide-eyed as Jake told carefully edited versions of their great-grandparents' story, leaving out the darkest parts but preserving the essential truth of love and courage in the face of hardship. Over dinner one evening, surrounded by Benjamin's descendants, Jake felt something shift inside him. This was what Catherine and Thomas had died for, what Benjamin had spent his life building despite his trauma. This warm, loud, loving family was their legacy, proof that goodness could survive tragedy, that love could triumph over violence and loss. After 2 weeks in Denver, Jake made his decision. He accepted Sarah's partnership offer with the condition that he could spend time at the cabin when needed, maintaining it and ensuring its protection. Sarah agreed immediately, drawing up papers that formalized their arrangement and guaranteed Jake's access to the place that had changed both their lives. Before Jake left to begin setting up the Montana operations, he made one final visit to Benjamin's grave. This time he brought flowers, winter roses that Sarah had helped him select, and he stood before the headstone with a sense of completion rather than obligation. "I kept my promise," he said quietly to the man beneath the stone. "Your parents' story has been found, has been honored, has been passed to your daughter, who will guard it well. And I want you to know that they raised a remarkable son, who became a remarkable father, who created a remarkable family. Everything you built, everything you protected them from, it was worth it. They're thriving, Benjamin. You did good." The wind whispered through the cemetery, and Jake imagined he could feel approval in its touch. He turned and walked back toward the gates, toward midnight, waiting patiently, toward the life he was choosing to build rather than the drifting he had been enduring. Spring came early to Montana that year, melting the snow and coaxing green shoots from the frozen earth. Jake oversaw the establishment of the new ranch operations with the efficiency born of decades of experience, training young cowboys who reminded him of himself at their age, full of dreams and determination. He visited the cabin regularly, sometimes alone, sometimes with Sarah when she made her annual pilgrimage. On one of those visits in late summer, Jake sat on the cabin steps watching the sun set over the mountains, midnight grazing peacefully nearby. He pulled out a leather journal he had bought in Denver, fresh and unmarked, and opened it to the first page. For a long moment, he stared at the blank paper, then began to write. "My name is Jake Morgan, and this is how I came to care about people I never met, about stories that were not my own but became mine through the simple act of bearing witness." He wrote about the storm and the discovery, about Catherine and Thomas and Benjamin, about Sarah and the family that had welcomed him into their circle. He wrote about Mary and the grief he had carried, about how other people's memories had somehow helped him honor his own. When he finished, the sun had set completely, and the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Jake closed the journal and placed it carefully in the chest alongside the others, adding his voice to the chorus of witnesses who had documented love and loss in this sacred place. Someday, perhaps, someone else would find this cabin in a storm. They would discover not just one family's tragedy, but a testament to the way stories connect us across time and distance, the way remembering the dead keeps us tethered to what matters. Jake stood and stretched, feeling the familiar ache in his joints that came from a day's hard work, but also feeling something he hadn't felt in years: contentment. He was part of something now, woven into a narrative that stretched backward to Catherine and Thomas and forward to Sarah's children and beyond. He had found his purpose not in isolation, but in connection, not in forgetting, but in remembering. As he prepared to ride back to the ranch, Jake took one last look at the cabin, at the names carved above the door, at the chest visible through the window. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new work, but tonight he carried with him the knowledge that he had honored the dead well, and in doing so, had found his way back to living.